Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Aisha Subarkash. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed the military offensive on Gaza would continue for as long as necessary. And he has made good on that promise as Israeli warplanes stepped up their airstrikes. An attack on Sunday targeted several apartment buildings, leaving dozens of people dead, according to Palestinian officials. Israel says it's targeting Hamas leaders and the group's weapons depots. But pictures of bombed-out residential areas and civilian casualties are telling a different story. One building that Israel destroyed housed the offices of international news outlets, the Associated Press and Al Jazeera. And the violence isn't limited to Gaza. A wave of unrest has also spread within Israel itself as Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel face off against each other. International efforts to broker a ceasefire have stalled. And the U.S. has blocked multiple efforts by the UN Security Council to issue a joint statement condemning the violence. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has criticized Joe Biden, saying the U.S. president has blood on his hands for approving weapons sales to Israel. So what will it take to stop these attacks? And can the international community come together to broker a ceasefire? And to answer that, joining me from Istanbul is Oguz Celikkol. He is a lecturer at Istanbul Kültür University and Turkey's former ambassador to Israel. From Ramallah, Nour Odeh. She is a former spokesperson for the Palestinian Authority. And from Melbourne, CJ Werleman. He is a journalist and author. Warm welcome to you all. It's good to have you on the program. Oz, as the death toll from the Israeli airstrikes on Gaza is mounting, Israel's Netanyahu says that the airstrikes are to continue at full force. What does that mean and where is this headed?
Well, the problem is Mr. Netanyahu for a long time gave up all negotiating settlement process. He is blocking Oslo process now. He's blocking the two-state solution. He's not really negotiating with the Palestinian Authority. And he's following an expansionist policy in the West Bank. He is following a policy of settlements, Jewish settlement policy in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And he is, of course, resorting to violence against the Palestinians.
So does this have the potential of being worse than his latest assault on Gaza in 2014?
I think, they are connected to each other because, as I pointed out, Mr. Netanyahu is no longer following a policy of negotiated settlement. Mm-hmm. He is following a policy of annexation of the West Bank, most of the West Bank, and he is not following any longer two-state solution.
Yes.
He wants to expand Israeli territories in the West Bank, and he is not negotiating with the Palestinian Authority in good faith.
Okay, so Nour, could you talk to us about the humanitarian situation in Gaza? How do you think the Gazans could endure without water and electricity?
Well, they don't have many options, do they? Palestinians in Gaza are half of the population are children. Mm-hmm. This is an extremely impoverished population, especially after being under an illegal Israeli siege for about 15 years. Everything that enters into Gaza is subject to Israeli restrictions, and healthcare is barely holding on. And the poverty level is astounding. The unemployment level is more than half of the population is unemployed. So there is a real humanitarian crisis that was already there before this latest aggression by Israel on Gaza. And right now, although the residents, a lot of them might be struggling literally to provide food for their families, mm-hmm. They don't have other option, and frankly, they don't have many places where to seek help and assistance. Yeah. All humanitarian organizations in Gaza are stretched thin. Their resources are dwindling, and they need outside support to provide for this unfolding tragedy.
We know that Qatar's Red Crescent office was also struck by Israeli airplanes, but who is to extend a helping hand to Gazans? And we also know that they're also fighting the COVID-19.
Yes, and the only clinic that actually does COVID testing in Gaza was also targeted and completely destroyed. So right now there is no testing going on in Gaza. I think the best that people can do is to provide assistance to organizations already on the ground, like the Palestinian Red Crescent and others. But really, the best help that can be offered to Palestinians at the moment is to stop the Israeli aggression, but not to stop there. Stopping the Israeli assault is not enough. Making sure that it never happens again is what's required. This is not the first time Israel pummels the Gaza Strip and its civilian population. We need to make sure that Israel is held accountable, and we need to make sure that a political resolution is back on the table. Your guest earlier spoke about Israel's abandonment of a political solution.
Yes, we will get into those momentarily.
By personal inaction, without returning to that and to using international law as the standard, this suffering will, keep repeating. It will not stop. And every time it will be worse than the time before.
Yes, this violence cycle repeats itself. We saw violence in 2009 and then saw it again in 2014. So, CJ, what do you make of the international reaction to this latest violence?
Well, I mean, as the guest alluded to, the Palestinians have been isolated internationally. They've been isolated from international action. They've been isolated from international aid and isolated from international solidarity. We've seen, predictably, the response from the Biden administration, turning to boilerplate talking points that the United States has always, iterated in defense of Israel when it's defending the indefensible. These are straight up Israeli war crimes against the Palestinians in Gaza. But more importantly, in this situation, it's not just the United States which has cut the Palestinians adrift. It's also these Arab governments which normalized Israel, which basically, sold the Palestinians or threw the Palestinians under a great big blue and white Israeli bus in exchange for, the latest fighter jets, the F-35 fighter jet surveillance technologies and access to Israeli markets. Now, these Arab governments promised that normalizing Israel would end Palestinian humiliation, end Palestinian suffering, and would resolve the Palestinian political issue. But that hasn't been the case, and that lie has now been exposed.
So, Oz, what do you make of the U.S. position in supporting Israel's right to self-defense? And of course, maybe more importantly, on the Biden administration's approval of the $735 million worth of arms sales to Israel. Has this approval given Israel green light to attack more on the Palestinians and, in a way, also stonewalling the left-leaning Democrats who think a certain amount of pressure should be put on Israel? What's your take on that?
Yes, unfortunately, we have been seeing for a long time. We have seen during the Trump administration, 4 years of Trump administration, unconditional support of Mr. Netanyahu's extremist policies by the United States. Biden is not, different from, much different from the past U.S. administrations. But he is now facing from his own party, especially the people who helped him to win the election against Trump. The liberal wing of his political party is trying to change the things in the United States. But in essence, U.S. administration, current UN administration is not much different from the past American administration who supported Israeli expansionist policies in the past.
So, Nour, can we say that the U.S. is still committed to human rights and freedoms, and how Biden is different than Trump when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, unfortunately, the U.S. declared commitment to human rights has always excluded Palestinians and has always afforded Israel with an exceptionalism that, puts it above international law, above accountability, above even verbal reproach. The U.S., the Biden administration has blocked an informal meeting, an informal statement by the UN Security Council 3 times.
Yes.
All the while providing Israel with political cover, support, and weapons, as we have found out in the past 12 hours or so. So the situation in terms of policy has not really changed. Sure, Biden sounds a lot better than Trump. His base of voters are far more pro-Palestinian, but he belongs to a traditional school in the Democratic Party that does not really see Palestinians on equal human footing with their Israeli counterparts, and believes that defending Israel is first and foremost an American strategic significance. I think that popular pressure will, in the end, influence that and move it further and move it more towards where it should be.
Yes.
But for the time being, right now, Biden is complicit in what's happening in Gaza. There's no doubt about that.
So, CJ, among the Muslim countries, Turkey, Malaysia, and Pakistan stood up against Israel. What do you make of the OIC and the Arab League's position? Why they are still scrambling on how to react, and what is holding them back?
Well, I mean, these collective security groups basically only represent the interests of the most powerful states amongst their members, that being Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Now, these two countries were the two countries which spearheaded the normalization, these Abraham Accords. Also were the two countries which endorsed wholeheartedly Donald Trump's deal of the century. I don't think you're going to see the OIC or the Arab League or any of these other umbrella organizations step out of line with what is, or be inconsistent with what is UAE or official Saudi Arabian policy.
So do you believe that these Abraham Accords are still relevant? And now that some prominent Arab countries are forced to be silent, does this political environment provide more room for Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah to maneuver within the region? What's your take on that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is a massive public relations win for those entities you've just named, including Turkey and Iran. These Arab Gulf countries which normalized the apartheid regime of Israel basically gambled on the fact that the Palestinian or the Arab street rather had lost interest or stopped caring about its historical ties to the Palestinian people. It's a gamble which has proven to be wrong. And every day that millions of Arabs in the Middle East turn on Al Jazeera or turn on turning on other networks, and they see Palestinian children being pulled out of the rubble of burning buildings, incinerated and pulverized to death, this is only increasing the angst that the Arab street has towards these regimes. So I can imagine if you're sitting in the royal palaces in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi right now, you'd be experiencing a lot of discomfort.
Okay. So, Oz, what should be the next action plan moving forward? We know that Turkish President Erdogan also proposed a joint commission comprising representatives of 3 major religions to administer Jerusalem. Is this viable, or is this a too ambitious goal? He also offered to set up an international peace force in the region. Is this possible?
I think of course, it is very difficult because the UN Charter gives keeping the peace in the world to the Security Council, but unfortunately, Security Council is being blocked by the US actions, veto, And so Security Council cannot move. And there is only one option in front of the states, that is extraordinary meeting of the General Assembly. And that's what's going to happen, I guess, this week, in the second half of this week. The important thing is, I think we start to think and we start to discuss the idea of putting the Palestinian people under the Israeli occupation, who are facing violence every day, into international protection. This is not easy, I know, and the General Assembly resolutions are not binding, even though they have been adopted by 2/3 majority of the UN membership. They are not binding, but unfortunately, United States is blocking Security Council, and there is only one option in front of us, to call extraordinary meeting of the General Assembly,
Yes.
and pass a resolution and start influencing the world public opinion that the time is come to put the Palestinians under the kind of protection by the international community, and sending an international force to the occupied West Bank and Gaza, to protect Palestinians from the Israeli violence.
So, Nour, would it be a welcome move by the Palestinians?
I think any measure of protection would be welcomed by the Palestinians, who also understand the complexities of the international system, and the fact that the U.S. and Israel will do whatever they can to make sure that nobody is on the ground to protect Palestinians. This has been, a long-standing Israeli policy. Even in negotiations with the Palestinian side, Israel was always adamant that it would not accept the presence of any outside force, even in the context of a permanent solution to the conflict. But I want to say that one of the ways that Palestinians can be provided with protection is by individual and collective action at the grassroots and state level, to make sure that Israel's occupation and transgressions are costly. Israel has to face consequence, and seeing how the international system continues to fail them because of U.S. veto, and also, let me say, but because of the complicity of many European actors who now have the audacity to equate between Palestinians, the occupied Palestinians, and the occupier, which is Israel, and a super power in the military and economic sense. Sanctions have to be imposed, and they are possible. They can be imposed individually by countries. Products made by Israel or companies that perpetuate the occupation of Palestine can be boycotted, and they should. Mm-hmm. Raising the cost of this colonial occupation is the way forward, and it is, it's a tactic that will hurt this occupation and make it less viable. In the absence of responsible collective international action, I think this is one way Palestinians can feel a sense of real solidarity and protection, because this will shorten the lifespan of their suffering under occupation.
So, speaking of a real solidarity among Palestinians, CJ, do you believe that there are any prospects for Palestinians getting together and leaving their rivalry behind? In other words, could Hamas and Fatah reconcile to confront the Israeli aggression? Are you hopeful about that?
That question's probably a little bit above my pay grade, and certainly when it comes to the intricacies of Palestinian politics, it's very complex. But I will say this, and this would be only my guess, that Israeli action that's occurring in Gaza is going to strengthen Hamas's political position, and weaken the position of the Palestinian Authority, which is, explains why President Abbas has delayed or put off the forthcoming elections.
Yes.
He senses what most outside observers, sense to be the reality on the ground, that this is a political win for Hamas. It would become a political loss for Hamas if Israel was to thoroughly and, well, maybe fully degrade Hamas's ability to govern or carry out counterstrikes against the Israeli military. But I think that's something way off in the future. And yeah, I'll let somebody else tackle that very difficult question.
So, as a former diplomat, could it all get back to normal once the hostilities are ceased? And do you believe that the two-state solution is a dream now?
I think that's the only way out at the moment. The problem is how to convince Israel to return back to negotiating table with the Palestinians in order to realize the two-state solution. Because if we don't have the two-state solution, the violence, the Israeli violence against the Palestinians will continue. We have been seeing this for a long time. So that's the only option in front of the international community. But here the question, the real challenge is that how to convince the Israeli authorities, Israeli government into returning back to Oslo process and a real two-state solution.
Yes.
Because that's what they are not following at the moment. They are following annexation, colonization policies in the West Bank, and that is the main cause of the conflict we have been facing today.
So, Nour, how has this latest unrest impacted intercommunal violence in Israel's mixed cities? What is the latest? And are you worried about these latest clashes between Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel could cause irreparable harm and even trigger a civil war? What's the latest on that?
Well, I would first allow me to invite you to call them Palestinian Israelis. That's how they like to be defined. Look, the scenes we've seen inside Israeli cities or so-called mixed cities were not surprising to Palestinians. The reality of Palestinian Israelis is one of discrimination, of disenfranchisement, of frustration. And what happened over the month of Ramadan in Jerusalem only amplified that frustration and also amplified the sense of solidarity and oneness between Palestinians inside the occupied territory and inside Israel proper. Netanyahu has done a superb job in encouraging the right wing in Israel, in mainstreaming incitement and hateful rhetoric against Palestinian Israelis. The Israeli police stands accused by human rights organizations of colluding with these lynch mobs who've been going around cities like Lid and Haifa and Akka and others, searching, hunting for Palestinian victims, attacking homes and attacking places of worship. So these scenes are emblematic of 10 years of rule of the right wing and the extreme right wing and the infiltration of the settler movement mentality into mainstream Israel inside the Green Line. I believe it was inevitable. The question now is, will Israel face any international pressure to answer for this discrimination, to answer for reports by Human Rights Watch and even B'Tselem that it is an apartheid system?
So, CJ, I know that you're also fighting against Islamophobia. How has rising Islamophobia across Europe and elsewhere hampered efforts to support Palestinians through governments and non-governmental organizations? And what could better expose the transparency of, let's say, Western or civilized concerns of for human rights than Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, the Palestinians have been otherized like Muslims around the world have under the rubric of the war on terror. War on terror discourse, posits Muslims to be the referent object in national security discourse, and that discourse has been, transplanted over to the Palestinian people. So, for people who aren't who don't follow or don't understand the complexities, or they're not even complexities, who don't understand the contours of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that it is a brutal military occupation subjugating an occupied and indigenous population. They see it through a civilized Western European colonial society trying to subjugate, savage natives. And that thing, and for this reason, that whilst neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups throughout Europe and the United States hate the Jewish people, they actually love the state of Israel, which goes to show that Zionism has very little connection with Judaism, but Zionism has a very close relationship with fascism and white supremacy.
All right, CJ, Oza, and Nour, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining us on Straight Talk. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Aisha Suberkash. If you've got any comments, follow us and tweet us at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.